Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on the virtual premises of the Institute for History of Medicine and Foreign Languages, which is part of the First Faculty of Medicine at the Charles University in Prague. My name is Tomáš Alušík and I am Associate Professor of the Institute. As some of you may know, from time to time we organize lectures where speakers talk about a broad range of topics, more or less connected with the underlying theme of history and archaeology of medicine. This year is no exception, but some of these activities take place in the virtual settings. Speaking of which, I would like to ask everyone in the audience to keep your microphone muted and your cameras turned off. I would also like to inform you that this lecture is recorded and will be uploaded to the First Faculty of Medicine official YouTube channel within a few days. I don't want to waste your time, so let me first thank everyone in the audience for coming here. It's nice to meet you. And I would also like to thank the speaker, Dr. Linda Fibiger. Linda got her bachelor's degree in archaeology in Dublin and Master of Science in Human Osteology and Paleopathology in Bradford. In 2009, she completed her doctoral degree on interpersonal violence in Neolithic Europe at the University of Oxford. From 2009 to 2011, Linda was based at Cardiff University, and in 2012, she joined the School of History, Classics and Archaeology of the University of Edinburgh, where she was appointed as lecturer in human osteoarchaeology, and in 2018, she was promoted to senior lecturer. She is currently also a research scientist on the Fall of 1200 BC European Research Council project, where she is leading the osteoarchaeological analysis of human skeletal remains from the Balkans. In her research, she specializes in the area of bioarchaeology, but especially conflict archaeology, violence, trauma, ethics, and experimental bioarchaeology. Linda's most recent work is focusing on interpersonal violence and cranial trauma. Her today's presentation will draw on a number of population and site-based studies from prehistoric Europe that have addressed some of the challenges, showing how age, gender, and local practice influence patterns of violence found in the bioarchaeological record. Linda, please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, Tomáš. So I'm going to share my screen now and get going. Ooh. Okay, you're all very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So as Tomáš said, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges we face then when investigating conflict and violence in the historic and prehistoric past, especially through skeletal analysis. And I'm going to do this through a number of site and population-based studies and some references to experimental bioarchaeological work. Before I get started, I just want everybody to know that due to the topic, of course, my presentation will include visual material of human remains. So to start off, maybe a brief word why we're interested in violence, why I'm interested in violence. Unlike other archaeological investigations, which usually present us with the result of medium or longer term processes, skeletal evidence for conflict in the form of trauma offers evidence for very precise moments in remote time. So that precise moment when an particular injury, a particular trauma was inflicted. But we're of course not just interested in that moment, we're interested in the physical, but also the psychological, personal, social, and political impact resulting from these moments. And that's, what I'm trying to investigate as a bioarchaeologist. The role of the skeleton in these investigations is, of course, central. Skeletal remains offer very important insights into individual and collective life histories, depending on whether you're looking at them as individuals or on a population base. And these studies are very inclusive in a sense that we can look at all of the skeletal record, we're not just focusing on a particular subsection of society, we're looking at everybody who happens to have been buried in the past, and these remains are accessible to us for analysis. Skeletal remains also offer the only primary evidence for physical and sometimes structural violence, for physical violence in a sense that other archaeological evidence like weapons, fortifications, iconography, texts, they offer us insights into the potential for and prospect of violence, but it's really only injuries on the skeleton that can tell us that physical violence actually happens. When I've referred to structural violence, what I'm here talking about is social or political structures or institutions that can result in disadvantage and inequality in health and well-being. And we see a lot of that in today's society, but we can also have a look at that in the past. For today, I'm going to mostly focus on physical violence and direct violent conflict in the past. So the topics we're interested within that are, of course, conflict and change, episodes or events, violent events in the past are often related to periods of change or might be the impetus for change in the past. When we look at the skeletal evidence, we can look at the scale of conflict and violence. This is through prevalence rates, how many individuals were directly affected by physical violence. And all of this can help us to kind of look at the character of violence in the past. I put invisible violence there as well. This is referring back to structural violence, forms of violence that might not be obvious through other material remains, but you know, inequality and disadvantages in health and well-being, these might also be read from the skeletal remains. Ultimately, what all of this provides for us as well are experiential insights into the past that help us to understand the role and meaning of conflict and violence. So we're not studying trauma for its own sake. We're looking at it in its wider social and biocultural context. So how do we communicate conflict and evidence of conflict in the past? And before I get into my case studies, I thought it was an important point to address, and that is something we can struggle with quite often as archaeologists and as scientists, where information we're giving in, you know, seminars as published, you know, sources can easily be taken out of context or embellished. And this is particularly challenging when we talk about conflict and violence in the past. And this is something I've started thinking about more through my involvement in a couple of publication projects, which I've just listed here. And I particularly want to refer to the Darker Angels of Our Nature, which is basically a challenge to Steven Pinker's theory on the history of violence. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, Pinker basically in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, creates this picture of us living in this golden age and this quasi-evolutionary view of violence and conflict in the past, where we're looking at prehistory as this age of anarchy and violence, and we're getting less and less violent as we move towards the modern times. I can't go into this any further as part of this seminar, but for those of you who are interested in the history of violence, this is something interesting to look at. But coming back to this question of how we communicate conflict, I think language is really important. And again, I've given you a couple of examples here. The one on the right, that's a few years back now, a study by Boulestin et al. In antiquity, looking at a small subsection of remains from a very famous early Neolithic site, Herxheim in Germany, concluding that the evidence they saw was sign of not just cannibalism, but mass cannibalism. And then above that, you see the newspaper headline from The Independent in the UK, how these kind of terms and statements are then taken and how the popular or press then runs with this. The same on the left, Stone Age massacre offers earliest evidence of human warfare. This is based on an article by La et al. in nature. And again, this is a particularly interesting one to go back to if anybody is interested, because if you go to the original source, you also see kind of responses to this article by other scientists who actually disagree with the initial researchers' findings. And again, the choice of using the term warfare in this very early Holocene context is interesting, because if we use these very loaded terms like cannibalism, mass cannibalism, warfare, we need to make sure we properly define them and in the context we're using them in, because they're loaded terms and they easily kind of open the door to very kind of speculative and maybe not exactly correct interpretations of what these conflicts actually reflected for people in the past. So this is just a word of caution. And finally, also about images. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with this particular site. This is an image from an exhibition at the museum in Halle in Saxony-Anhalt in Germany. And this is a mass grave from the Battle of Lützen. From the 30 Years' War, which has now been restored and fixed into place and mounted on the wall, on one of the walls inside the museum exhibition. And you can see the strip running down the center. I don't have the chat function. I should have mentioned at the start, if I speak, if I don't speak clearly, you have questions, please, shout and I'll try to clarify. So you have the strip running down the middle, which is actually a result of, when this burial, which was excavated, it was actually block lifted. And you can see the size of it is huge. And when they realized they're not able to fit it into the particular building where the detailed excavation was meant to follow, they just cut it in half with the saw. And this is the strip you're seeing there in the middle. So there's various questions there about the ethics of how these remains were handled, but also whether showing this particular skeletal assemblage, these individuals and the way they're shown, and also fixing them permanently in time, therefore also fixing the narrative about what happened to them in time, whether that's the correct way to go about it. So these are just some thoughts to start us off with, but I now want to introduce you to one of my case studies. And this is resulting from the project I'm involved in at the moment that Tomasz mentioned in the very nice introduction he gave, The Fall of 1200 BC, which looks at the role of migration and conflict in social crises at the end of the Bronze Age in Southeastern Europe. So as part of this project, we're considering the collapse of Europe's first urban civilizations in the Aegean, the proto-urban groups of the Balkans, and what happens during this period, movement of people, spread of new social practices across cultural boundaries. We're trying to look at links between personal mobility and status, gender, identity, and health. And the methods that are employed include bioarchaeology, so my own work has been bioarchaeological, but also looking at mortuary data, biomolecular data, aDNA and stable isotopes, material culture, settlement patterns, etc. And hopefully all of this at the end will allow us a better insight into lived reality and social differences in this place and time. Okay, so the site I want to introduce you to is Gomulava, which is located, as you can see on the map, on the edge of the Carpathian Basin. And you can see me, the little blue dot, sitting in Edinburgh at the moment there on the top left. So in this area, during the late Bronze Age, we have a pattern of megaforts and massive enclosed sites that dominate this area, which are destroyed and abandoned between 1300 and 1200 BC, as are cremation cemeteries. So there's a change in mortuary practice during this period, and settlement patterns and population levels in mortuary practice. So the societal collapse is followed by much more thinly by a much more thinly occupied region, so there's less people in the area. This might also have been impacted by climate and environmental change, but a landscape that should have continued to flourish was utterly decimated. And then people return in increasing numbers around the mid-11th century BC, but it's not really until the 9th century that population numbers seem to recover. Some, Bronze Age sites are reoccupied, but not to the same level as pre-1200 BC. So what's interesting for us now is that these newly emerging networks of people were set within contested landscapes. And Gomolava is situated near to the border of varied cultural traditions, including groups that, material culturally at least, are the successors of the local, Bronze Age groups. But these border on the late Urnfield traditions to the west, as well as pre-Scythian mobile pastoralists to the north. And these present, of course, newcomers to the area at the time when also the Thraco-Cimmerian horizon emerged. So don't worry about the details, but what you do need to take away here is that this area embodies, these different groups embody competing ideology of landscape use and the role of permanent settlement within it. So you have more permanent models of settlement, more mobile ones. So Gomolava is in a kind of borderland of different cultural traditions. So this is where we are contextually and chronologically. So in 1954, a mass grave was excavated, what was found. First of all, I should say it was excavated in 3 days. So I'm not going to comment on that any further. Obviously, they were very, very fast at the time. A number of individuals, at least 36, mostly crouched or prone, lots of women and children, some that couldn't be sexed. There was only 2/3 of the grave preserved. So we probably had around 54 individuals in total originally. That's an estimation. Very few finds, and those metal finds that were present were very basic. Unfortunately, after this brief initial analysis, the remains were, in inverted commas, reburied in the river. So basically, they just, put the remains back into the river, so they're lost to us now. But another mass grave was excavated in 1971, and this is the case study I want to talk about today. So you see the mass grave under excavation here, and this is a digitization of the original plans completed by Sarah Newland, and hopefully you can see here this mass grave is much larger, and also includes the remains of a cow. They're shaded in gray. Hopefully you can see that. And you can also see that it includes more elaborate metal finds. And some of the metal finds are indicated in the grave. You can hopefully see them in green. And there's a picture there at the top left. Okay, so what did we know about this grave before we reanalyzed it as part of the fall? We knew there were about 78 skeletons in contracted positions, seem to have been buried or, put into the grave at 3 different levels. And this information comes to us from the excavator who published this in the early 1970s. Farkas carried out the first osteological analysis, noted 21 females, at males, 45 children, and emphasized there was no trace of violent death, and suggested that the grave was the result of a pandemic or other catastrophe which necessitated fast burial. This is reconfirmed by Zoffman in the late 90s, who again states there's no signs of injury on the bones. There must be the result of a pandemic. And then in 2016, the current curator in Novi Sad, Jovan Koledin, states that previous analysis using methodology of physical anthropology were not sufficient to answer the question about the character of the remains. So this is where the fall comes in. What did we do next? Well, as a bioarchaeologist, I carried out a very detailed reanalysis of the remains, and we also sampled the remains for DNA and isotope analysis and C14 dating. So who was buried at Gomolava? Here you have an overview of the age and sex distribution of the remains. So look at the age distribution first on the left. So this graph is dominated, as the initial analysis already indicated, by young individuals, children and adolescents, almost 3/4 of them, and a much smaller proportion of adults. But that's interesting. And in a sense, I suppose we do expect a high number of children in any death assemblage in the past, though a mass grave is, of course, no ordinary funerary context. What's equally interesting, though, is the sex distribution. And you can see that of the sexed individuals, a huge proportion are females. And I'm saying females, not just women, because this includes adults as well as children. Obviously, it's virtually impossible to confidently assign sex to children just through standard osteological methods, but we were lucky enough to have very good aDNA preservation. And while we weren't able to carry out this analysis, this biomolecular analysis on all individuals, on the ones we did, in the child assemblage, the sex distribution seems to be very similar to that in the adults, i.e. predominantly girls, represented here as well. So again, this is not a standard, expected sex distribution if you were looking at the in-life ratio of males versus females. So there's something very particular going on here, predominance of women and girls. Obviously, we didn't just, we carried out a wider osteological analysis. So we looked at, for example, stress indicators. So there was clear evidence of episodes of systemic stress evident in the teeth through enamel hypoplasia, which are these kind of line of arrested growth that are very visible in the teeth. And we saw this in adolescents and adults, but not really in children. So clearly these are, as I said, episodic stress kind of time. So it's not a constant stressor that affects everybody, because the evidence we have in the teeth, because the teeth form during adulthood, enamel hypoplasia tells us about stress in childhood, of course, so, and in the children that were buried there, we didn't really have high rates of enamel hypoplasia. In contrast, cribra orbitalia rates, so there's an image of a case of cribra orbitalia at the bottom right. So you have this porous appearance of the orbits. So these, this condition was prevalent with rates of up to 90% throughout the assemblage, potentially indicative of anemias or deficiency diseases, even parasitic infections. One potential explanation in this particular context is endemic levels of malaria. Malaria used to be endemic in Serbia until the early 20th century, was then seen as eradicated. It is now seen a comeback. So Gomolava is situated at the bend of the river Sava, providing the warm and humid environment mosquitoes thrive on. So, so there was, as a takeaway message again, there were some stresses evident in the population. A study by other researchers, which I want to just very briefly refer to, who looked at cross-sectional geometry, so the size and shape of the long bones in the women at Gomolava, found they saw high levels of habitual, at times repetitive, but not necessarily physically detrimental, strenuous activity. So this population was, based on this study, relatively physically active. So there are some systemic stresses. There's also physical activity. So how did these individuals die? So the reanalysis of the remains, emphasizing again the importance of going back to these older collections, clearly showed that these individuals died very violent deaths, with over 1/5 of individuals showing unhealed skeletal injuries that were not picked up by any of the researchers that looked at the assemblage previously. And this is not about trying to diminish work that was carried out in the 70s and the 90s, but I should emphasize that our understanding of skeletal trauma and the way it's identified has come along a lot in the last couple of decades, mainly based on a lot of forensic work. So we're much better able now to recognize and analyze these traumata. So as I said, a fifth of individuals showing unhealed skeletal injuries, and my analysis recorded a high number of cranial blunt force trauma, with relatively equal prevalence rates between the different age groups and the sexes. The right side, as well as the back and the top, of the head were affected, indicating an attacker-victim constellations that isn't standard. So it's not a question of two individuals facing each other. Instead, we probably have affected individuals in a potentially disadvantaged position, that is, facing away from their attacker, who often appears to have been either taller or in an elevated position, for example, on horseback. And many of the injuries are extensive and were delivered with uninhibited force designed to execute the individual. There are also unhealed postcranial injuries, so not just affecting the head, but the rest of the body. Unlike those to the head, which seem to have been mostly close contact injuries, those to the shoulder and pelvis at least. So you can see the pelvis there on the bottom right, the shoulder on the top left. They probably involve projectiles as well. You also have a defensive injury of the upper arm on the top right, which was identified as a sharp force injury. So in summary, the group buried at Gomolova has exceptional demographic characteristics with the predominance of women paired with a large proportion of juveniles. And it's characterized by relatively low dental pathology rates and frequent occurrence of calculus, but don't worry about the details of that. Initial isotope results indicate a very homogeneous dietary pattern. Signs of postcranial infections are also very low. So in that sense, they seem to be relatively healthy, but there are indications of episodic physiological stress indicated by enamel hypoplasia and exceptionally high rates of cribororbitalia that may suggest a more constant stressor, possibly malaria. And we also know that women were involved in high levels of physical activity. Okay. So violence appears to have been the cause of death in this group because obviously the physical signs of injury give us a minimum number of injuries present in the assemblage because not all trauma affects the skeleton. Okay, so there can be no doubt that this was a targeted attack designed to exterminate this group. So coming back to our considerations of crisis, which I outlined as part of the fall of 1200 BC project. So we have sedentary life race versus more mobile pastoralism, competing traditions, and looking at the demography of the grave. One of the first questions, of course, is where are the men? So the majority of men are away at the time of the massacre, maybe suffered a similar fate, were buried elsewhere. Maybe they were taken alive for other purposes, or did the men of the group even agree to this as a trade-off? Maybe the better way to solve this is to ask why were women and girls targeted? So the young and also women might be seen as a currency for ensuring the future continuation of cultural defined life ways. So women might have been the main target in the first place. And this mass grave, which this large number of individuals clearly represents the end of the line for this particular group, especially the end of the female line, its total annihilation. And if we look at anthropological literature on pastoralist societies and gender, they give us a complementary and a picture of complementary and interconnected responsibilities and shared power and prestige in gender relations, men and women. So women did had a documented role to play. And of course, for the Iron Age, which this grave dates to, we have examples of female warriors and women of status. So here we have questions of ancestry, lineages, and the central role of women within it. And hopefully we're still waiting for more detailed analysis of the DNA data. We'll be able to, in due course, look in a more detailed way at the links between the different individuals in this particular grave. Okay, so this was looking at a case study at a particular site to answer questions on the why and how of conflict and trauma in the past. But how can we use a population-based approach to look at violence in the past? And for this, I want to briefly refer to work I've done looking at interpersonal violence in Neolithic Europe, where we have early farming societies, small-scale societies organized along lineages and families and settlement networks. It's also a period of technological advance, increasing specialization and division of labor. And why in the past, there used to be very heated debate whether the Neolithic was a period of relative peace or whether it was dominated by violence. Most research now would recognize that you could have periods of both, and the two are kind of not mutually exclusive. And for every site of conflict we find for the period, there's also other sites where we don't have any skeletal evidence for violence. So that's something that's important to recognize in view of, for example, Pinker's very biased view of the prehistoric past, telling us there was violence everywhere. Violence in the Neolithic is not institutionalized, so we don't have a warrior caste, for example, yet. And in the area I studied, Central and Northern and Western Europe, you don't have specialized weapons. You have what I term weapon tools. We presume violence is the domain of males. We have good ethnographic parallels for this and osteological case studies. Young women are often seen as valuable in terms of their childbearing potential. And this has been proposed in view of some of the mass fatality sites we have from the period, places like Aspern-Schletz and Thalheim, where the young women seem to be missing. So it's presumed they were taken away as slaves or for marriage because of their childbearing potential. Okay, and just a reminder that it's really skeletal trauma we need in these early periods to give us a good indication of the actual level of violence. Personally, I concentrated on head trauma. While the head only presents 12% of the body area, it's been the prime target for assault through the ages. This is strategic and psychological reasons, and there's good financial analogies for that. And also, I think in terms of this reference I made to the experiential qualities of trauma, we should also not remember that most people didn't die instantly, and there's aspects of trauma and violence that are not immediately obvious when we look at skeletal remains, but that should always be remembered. The level of blood, pain, shock related to a violent event, but also the long list of post-traumatic complications that may be caused by trauma and injury. Okay, and also again, a reminder that whatever evidence we have, it only ever gives us the minimum number of injuries present in an assemblage, because not all trauma causes injury to the skeleton itself. You have many soft injuries that would not be visible on skeletal remains. So who's affected? So my sample involved over 1,000 individuals from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. And what I'm showing you here is the percentage of individuals affected by heel trauma. This is dominated by males. So males statistically significantly, more affected by heel trauma that may be related to violence than women. So that fits with everything I said so far about what we know about Neolithic violence. But interestingly, when you look at unhealed trauma, males and females are equally affected. If we try to understand this further, let's have a look at the site of the head that's affected. So the males in blue, the women in this pinkish red color. So for the males, we have injuries to the front and to the left side mostly, which fits more with the face-to-face scenario. If we presume everybody in the past, like they are today, were right-handed, if two people face each other, one of them is right-handed and try to hit the other person on the head, they hit their front or their left side more likely. For women, it's quite a different pattern. You see here, the injuries are mostly to the right side and to the back. Okay, so this right side dominance of injuries in the female sample approaches significance. This is quite interesting. So there is different trends for men and women in the sample. So it's not the typical face-to-face conflict, but it seems to be indicating rather similarly to what I said to you about the injuries we see at Gomolava, that those affected might have been in a disadvantaged position in violent encounters rather than trained active participants. They might have been on the ground, fleeing, unarmed, victims of a surprise attack. And I think this is down, or proposing this is down, to increasing division of labor and lack of training. So we're looking at a period where the job, in inverted commas, of violence and fighting is increasingly attributed to one section of society, and these were the men. Okay, so both for Gomolava but also now for the Neolithic trauma study, I mostly talked about blunt force trauma. Okay, which is a very generic term meaning some sort of blunt implement caused an injury. So obviously we'd like to know more about the implements that may or may not have been used during this period. So to investigate this further, you can try and use experimental bioarchaeology, which we did. I mean, one of the challenges is, even though the Neolithic is part of the Stone Age, it's a bit of a misnomer because a lot of the material culture in the period actually wouldn't have been simply stone, but organic materials, especially wood, but also other things like leather, etc., fabrics, most of which don't survive, at least not in Western Europe, because we don't have the preservational conditions to allow survival of these organic materials. But sometimes we do. And I want to talk about one of these finds now, which is called the Thames Club, dated to the British Neolithic, found near Chelsea in the River Thames. And you can see the original there and the reconstruction that we've fashioned to carry out some experimental work to see how this Thames Club functioned as a club, because there's been a lot written about this, what this might have been, and suggestions include that it may have been a flax beater, so a tool to process flax, or that it might have been used as a club. But remember what I said early on about this period and this region, that we don't really have a good sense of definite weapons of violence, but things functioning as weapon tools. So a bit like a penknife, which has multiple functions. So what we did this, we made this replica, and then we got some symbone, which is artificial bone material initially used for ballistics testing, but we used it in these blunt force experiments. So basically we whacked this symbone sphere with this club and then try to have a look at the trauma pattern. I mean, it's not surprising that if you hit something hard enough, it breaks, but why was this exciting? When I looked at this fracture initially after the experiment, I went, oh, look at this. This reminds me of something I've seen somewhere. And it was this. This is an archaeological case from Asban-Schletz, one of these mass kind of violent sites I mentioned earlier on, dating to the early Neolithic, the linear Bandkeramik in Central Europe. So we basically reproduced almost an exact kind of copy of this injury found at Asban. So what that allows us to say is that implements like the Thames Club may have been used at the site and would have resulted in the death of some of these individuals. So we can try to get more specific and also close contact, violent interaction, having to go up close to somebody with a club is obviously quite different from using, for example, an arrow or spear where you can be at a much greater distance to your intended victim. But talking about longer range weapons, and I'm nearly done, just a few more slides. What I got interested in once we'd done these initial experiments, and also as a result of looking at some of the trauma cases from my Neolithic sample, is sling use in prehistoric Europe. Slings rarely survive archaeologically unless you find the ammunition like caches of sling stones, because again, the slings themselves are made out of organic material and would have long decayed. For the Neolithic in Europe, you do have some evidence of slingshot in Southeastern Europe, usually clay shot, but once you move into Central and Western Europe, there's nothing until you get to the Roman period, actually, where slings were used quite commonly, both by the indigenous population, but also by the Romans. Okay, so it rarely survives archaeologically, so that's not a good way to find it. But what I thought is it might be an idea to experimentally produce some slingshot injuries and look at it from an osteological perspective to see whether in the osteological record we have cases of trauma that may be attributed to slingshot. The sling, to me, also is one of the first democratic weapons because, and I didn't believe that before I got involved in this project, it's actually reasonably easy to use. It's also not a matter of size or strength. It's more a question of technique. And with a bit of training, anybody can learn how to use a sling. So slings are a specific tactic of physically and strategically managing violent interaction, but also hunting. And slings are still used in many parts of the world today as hunting weapons. So what does it take to become proficient? And I now, hopefully this works. I have a very short video for you also to demonstrate if you think maybe the sling might not be a very efficient weapon, you know, just to show you what a relatively experienced slinger can do and also how fast they can shoot. Okay, so that was Silvio Vaz, who has been slinging since childhood. And I collaborated with him on some experimental work on sling use. So what we did is I left it up to him to choose his ammunition. So you see the slingshot there at the bottom left, and the numbers of them indicate the weight in grams of the slingshot. So around the 200-gram mark. And you can see the sling he used there. And then again, we used this artificial bone material and set up some experiments. And what we also did is we got some of our students not using stones, health and safety, but using tennis balls to try out slinging. And within, let's say, an hour of using a sling, the one with a bit of a knack for it, actually after an hour could get the tennis ball off in the right direction. So give them a couple of weeks to practice and they'd actually be quite proficient slingers. And that included people of different height, age, gender. So again, coming back to this idea of the sling as a democratic weapon. So here's some of the injuries we produced. And you can see, hopefully, even if you know nothing about osteology, there's variations in the degree of damage caused from the top right, which is a kind of fairly small injury, to the one below it, which is quite extensive. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the examples of the injuries, cranial injuries I found in my Neolithic sample and let you compare them to those shin bone injuries. And hopefully, and I'm happy to be challenged on that, you can see some resemblance you know, between the archaeologically and the experimentally produced cases. So what I would postulate is that we do actually have sling use in Neolithic Europe. We don't find the sling archaeologically, but we may be able to identify it osteologically. So to sum up, and apologies if I went slightly over time, if we combine skeletal and experimental data, it allows us to challenge perceived notions on the levels of aggression in societies, but also on the role of gender and age. Numbers, i.e. prevalence rates, are important, but coming back to some of the things I said at the very beginning of this seminar, so is context and considered interpretation and language when we're describing and interpreting what we're seeing. It allows us to reconsider actual practices, what implements were used, who used them and when, and ultimately, and this is really what we're interested in, it allows us to have deeper insights into the meaning and consequences of violence for the individual and also for their communities. And I'd like to finish off with a quote by the late Holger Schütkowski, who taught me osteology many years ago. Whenever an ancient human skeleton which shows signs of trauma is excavated, it reminds us particularly that in addition to our scientific curiosity and interest in the underlying events, there are individual tragic fates connected with their respective victims. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. And I put my video back on as well.
Yes. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. You showed us a lot of very interesting evidence, which included also the very interesting use of experiments. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm opening the discussion, so you can turn your microphones on, and you can either ask directly or write your questions into the chat window. Or you can raise your hand, just anything you like.
Well, I can see at least one osteologist in the room, Susanna, so don't be shy.
Well, maybe I would ask you the first question. Do you know anything about the potential evidence of violence in the Neolithic Aegean? I can recall the skeletal set from Aleppo-Tripa cave, and as far as I remember, there were some cranial injuries.
There is, I mean, I don't know about more recent work, but there's a summary article in a volume that myself and my supervisor published, which is now nearly a decade ago, where one of the Greek contributors summarized some of the evidence. It wasn't, in terms of overall prevalence, it wasn't as high as some of the figures I got, but that is also interesting, I think, in a sense that coming back to Pinker and this uniform view of the world, that you will have, you know, local and regional differences. And also one could argue that the way I present my data as this big data block is also quite a kind of a dubious way to do this, because I obviously creating samples that range over, you know, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. This is obviously for statistical viability, but, you know, within that data set, there's some sites where I found no evidence for violence whatsoever, and others where there was much higher kind of levels. So there's a lot of local and micro-regional variation as well. And I'm not saying that what I presented is the picture for the Neolithic everywhere, you know. So, so as far as I know about the Aegean, the rates are slightly lower. I should also say that my sample from Scandinavia particularly was exceptionally well preserved. I've never worked on a prehistoric collection like that. And I mean, a lot of them were radiocarbon dated, so they were definitely Neolithic, but some of them almost looked like anatomical, you know, collection kind of skulls. They were so well preserved, including all the nasal bones, all the facial bones. So that was quite specific as well. So I think that's also where some of the higher figures come from, you know, coming back to preservation, taphonomy, etc. So I don't know whether that answered your question, but
yeah, thanks. Isn't the volume you were talking about sticks, stones, and broken bones?
Yeah.
I was reading some chapters some years ago. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any more questions? Yeah, there is one question coming from the chat. From your experience, have you seen more violence in Scandinavia than in other parts of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't look at, for my Neolithic work, I didn't look at Southeast Europe in detail, but I've since talked to researchers there. And again, I think some of the much lower numbers for that region might also potentially be sample quality and sample size related, because again, there's obviously a lot of the Scandinavian, but also German material comes from you know, megalithic tombs, which for all their issues with commingling of remains, if you're only looking at heads, you're okay, afford some level of protection in terms of preservation. Whereas if you're looking at simple inhumation graves and you know, different kind of settlement burials, etc., which are also quite common, then in Southeast Europe, they don't afford as much preservation. So, but from what I know, the figures for Scandinavia especially are higher than for Southeast Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. And are there any more questions from the audience? Anything from the chat? No, nothing from the chat. So, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Linda for this very excellent lecture with very interesting kind of evidence you showed us. And also, please let me thank everyone in the audience for your participation. I hope you enjoyed this lecture as I definitely did. And I wish you a very nice evening to everyone, and see you next time in this virtual settings. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Thomas.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.